In January of 2014, a retired curator from the British Museum named Irving Finkel sat down with a small, unassuming clay tablet that had been sitting in a private collection for decades, a piece so worn and water-damaged that most people would have walked right past it in a glass case without a second glance. It had been brought to him years earlier by a man named Douglas Simmons, whose father had picked it up in the Middle East sometime after the Second World War, with no real idea what it said or why it mattered. Finkel, one of the world's leading experts in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system pressed into wet clay by scribes nearly 5,000 years ago, spent years slowly working through its damaged surface, line by line, sign by sign. And when he finally finished translating it in full, he realized he was holding something that would quietly rewrite what billions of people think they know about one of humanity's oldest stories. The story of a catastrophic flood that wiped out almost all of mankind, and the ark that was built to survive it. Except this ark wasn't Noah's, it was older, much older. And it wasn't shaped like a boat at all. This single artifact, now known simply as the Ark Tablet, is a palm-sized chunk of clay covered in tightly packed Akkadian cuneiform script, dated to roughly the 18th century BCE. But scholars agree it is a copy of a far older Sumerian original, part of a tradition of flood narratives stretching back. An estimated 5,000 years to the very first cities of Mesopotamia, the region we now call Iraq, the literal cradle of writing itself. And what it describes is staggering. It is a set of construction instructions, given directly by a god to a man, for how to build a giant vessel to survive a coming flood sent to annihilate humanity. Sound familiar? It should, because centuries before the book of Genesis was compiled, before the Israelites even existed as a distinct people, Mesopotamian scribes were already writing down, in exhaustive technical detail, the blueprint for humanity's survival of a world-ending deluge, complete with a righteous man chosen to save every species of animal alive. But here's where it gets genuinely shocking, and where this tablet forces a rewrite of assumptions that most people never even realized they were making. The ark in this Sumerian and Babylonian tradition is not a long wooden ship with a pointed bow, the way children's books and Sunday school illustrations have drilled into our heads for centuries. It is round, perfectly circular. The tablet gives the god Enki's precise instructions to the flood hero, whose name in this particular version is Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise, describing a massive coracle, a giant version of the round reed and hide boats that were actually used on the rivers of ancient Iraq for thousands of years, and remarkably are still built by a handful of craftsmen in that region today. The tablet specifies the vessel's dimensions with the precision of an engineering document, calling for a circular hull with a floor area of 1 field, roughly 3,600 square meters, surrounded by walls made from coiled rope over 120 meters, long, sealed watertight with an enormous quantity of bitumen, the natural tar that bubbled up from the ground in ancient Mesopotamia and was used the way we use waterproof sealant today. Finkel calculated that a vessel of these proportions would have needed the hides of literally hundreds of animals to construct, an enormous, almost industrial-scale undertaking, and he has argued that these very specifications may be the ultimate ancient root of a detail embedded deep within the biblical flood story too, since Genesis specifies the ark was to be coated inside and out with pitch, using a Hebrew word closely related to the Akkadian word for bitumen used on this tablet thousands of years earlier. Now, before we go further, let's set the full picture, because this round ark tablet is just one piece of an entire buried library of Mesopotamian mythology dealing with human origins and human survival. And when you put the pieces together, the story they tell about where humanity supposedly came from is far stranger, far more mechanical, and far more unsettling than most people expect. The earliest layer of this tradition comes from Sumer itself, the world's first urban civilization, which rose along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers roughly 5,500 years ago. Sumerian scribes at the city of Nippur, one of the oldest and most sacred cities in Mesopotamia, recorded a creation account now referred to by scholars as the Eridu Genesis, portions of which describe the gods deciding, quite deliberately and quite bluntly, to create human beings for one specific purpose, to do the backbreaking labor that the gods themselves no longer wanted to perform. This is not a poetic footnote. It is the central, explicit premise of Mesopotamian creation mythology, repeated across multiple texts written centuries apart by completely different scribal schools. In the epic known as Atrahasis, arguably the most complete and important Mesopotamian creation and flood narrative ever recovered, the story opens with the line, "When the gods, like men, bore the work and suffered the toll." Before humans existed at all, the story explains, the senior gods, led by the sky god Anu, the air god Enlil, and the clever water god Enki, had assigned the grueling labor of digging, irrigation canals, and farming the land to a lower class of divine beings called the Igigi. For decades, maybe centuries in mythological time, these junior gods dug canals along the Tigris and Euphrates under brutal conditions, until one night they finally snapped, set fire to their tools, surrounded Enlil's house in open rebellion, and demanded to be freed from the endless toil. Terrified of a full-blown divine civil war, the senior gods called an emergency council, and it was Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, who proposed a radical solution. Instead of forcing the gods to keep digging, why not create an entirely new species, one specifically engineered to labor in humanity's place forever? According to the tablets, the mother goddess, called Ninhursag or Belet Ili, depending on the version, was brought in to actually perform the creation. The birth goddess mixed clay, the same raw materials scribes used to write these very tablets, with the flesh and blood of a slaughtered god, specifically a rebellious deity named We-Ila or Geshtue, killed and sacrificed for this exact purpose, so that his intelligence, described in the text as his Ilu, his god essence or spirit, would be forever bound into the new creation. 14 pieces of this clay and blood mixture were shaped and placed in the womb of 14 birth goddesses, and after a set period of divine gestation, 7 men and 7 women were born. The first human beings, created explicitly and unambiguously as a slave labor force to relieve the gods of physical work. Read that origin story next to the one most people grew up with, humans, created in the image of God to have dominion over the earth, and the contrast is jarring. In the older Mesopotamian telling, that predates the biblical account by well over 1,000 years, humans were not created as beloved co-rulers of creation. They were created as a workforce, manufactured to solve a labor dispute among the gods. The story does not end there, and this is where the flood narrative connects directly back to that Ark tablet Irving Finkel spent years translating. According to Atrahasis, humanity multiplied at an explosive rate once they took over agricultural and construction labor from the gods, and their sheer noise, described vividly in the text as a constant uproar and clamor that filled the land, began to disturb Enlil's sleep. Enlil, increasingly irritated, tried to solve his noise problem the way you might expect an ancient sky god to solve a problem, escalating punishment. First, he sent a plague. Humanity survived it, thanks to Enki secretly advising his favorite mortal, the wise man Atrahasis, on how to trick the gods of disease into backing off. Then Enlil sent a drought. Humanity survived that too, again with Enki's covert help. Finally, furious that his fellow gods kept sabotaging his plans, Enlil convened the divine council and demanded a permanent solution, one so severe that no human cleverness could undo it, a flood that would drown every single living creature on the face of the earth. And crucially, he swore the other gods to secrecy, forbidding any of them from warning a single human being about what was coming. Enki, bound by his oath not to directly warn any human, found an extraordinary loophole. According to the most vivid surviving version of the story, he did not speak to Atrahasis at all. Instead, he spoke to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, apparently unaware, Asau, or pretending to be unaware, that Atrahasis happened to be sleeping right on the other side of it. Through the wall, Enki described the coming catastrophe in full and gave detailed instructions for building a vessel to survive it, the very instructions preserved, dimension by dimension, on Irving Finkel's Ark tablet. Atrahasis built the great round vessel, loaded it with his family, his craftsmen, and, according to the fullest versions of the story, 2 of every living creature sealed the hull, with bitumen exactly as instructed, and rode out a flood so catastrophic that the text says even the gods themselves were horrified and cowered like frightened dogs at what they had unleashed, weeping and regretting their decision, as the storm raged for 7 days and 7 nights. If any of this is starting to sound eerily familiar, that is precisely the point, and it is exactly why this decoded tablet matters so much to historians of religion. The parallels between this 5,000-year-old Mesopotamian tradition and the story of Noah in the book of Genesis are not vague or coincidental. They are structurally, specifically, almost line by line identical in places. A wise, righteous man is secretly warned by a god of an impending flood meant to destroy humanity. He is given precise construction instructions for a vessel. He seals it with pitch or bitumen. He loads it with his family and pairs of every living animal. The flood lasts a defined, specific number of days. The vessel eventually comes to rest on a mountain. The hero releases birds, first one, then another, to determine whether the floodwaters have receded enough to find dry land. And afterward, the hero offers a sacrifice that pleases the returning gods, or God, who then promises never to send a flood of this magnitude again. Scholars of the ancient Near East have documented these parallels for over a century, ever since a version of the story was first found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, discovered on tablets from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the 1800s, and translated by a self-taught British scholar named George Smith in 1872, who reportedly became so excited upon realizing what he was reading that witnesses said he began tearing off his clothes in the middle of the British Museum. The going scholarly explanation is not that either tradition is a fabrication invented from nothing, but rather that both the Mesopotamian flood accounts and the biblical account of Noah descend from a shared, extremely ancient regional memory, almost certainly rooted in real, catastrophic flooding events that repeatedly devastated the low-lying floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates, river valley across multiple millennia. Archaeological excavations at the ancient Sumerian city of Shuruppak and separately at the site of Ur have uncovered thick, clearly defined layers of water-deposited silt sitting directly on top of settlement remains, physical evidence of genuine city-flattening floods that struck the region around 5,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries depending on the site. These were not necessarily global planet-covering events. To a farmer or a scribe living entirely within the flat floodplain of southern Iraq, however, a flood that submerged every field, every road, and every neighboring town as far as the eye could see would have looked and felt exactly like the end of the entire world, because for that civilization, it effectively was. Over successive generations, this raw, remembered trauma appears to have been passed down orally, reshaped into myth, eventually written down by Sumerian scribes, then adapted and rewritten by Babylonian, and Assyrian scribes as their empires absorbed Sumerian culture, and finally, most scholars believe, encountered and reworked once more by Hebrew scribes during or after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, when the deported people of Judah were living under Babylonian rule, directly exposed to Babylonian literature, temples, and scribal schools for the first time in their history. This is precisely why the Ark Tablet's decoding felt so seismic when it was finally published in full in 2014. It wasn't simply confirming that Mesopotamians also told a flood story, something scholars had already known for over 100 years, thanks to the Gilgamesh tablets. It was providing an extraordinarily specific, previously unknown, technical detail. The fact that the very earliest version of this ark, the prototype behind every ark story that followed it, was imagined as a giant circular reed boat rather than a rectangular wooden ship, a detail that had simply never survived in any previously known tablet. It rewrote something scholars thought they already fully understood. For over a century, historians had assumed the biblical description of a long, rectangular 3-story wooden vessel represented something close to how the entire regional flood tradition always imagined the ark. Finkel's tablet proved that the earliest layer of the tradition, the Sumerian and early Babylonian layer, imagined something completely different, something rounder, more primitive, and far closer to boats that Mesopotamian riverboat builders were still using in the 20th century, and in some remote villages, are still using today. It means the shape of the ark itself evolved and changed as the story passed from culture to culture across 2,000 years of retelling, with the rectangular, more ship-like design we now consider iconic, likely emerging only in later versions of the tradition. Beyond the ark and the flood, there is another piece of the Mesopotamian record that deserves just as much attention because it deals directly with human origins in an even stranger, more literal way, and it comes from a document called the Sumerian King List. This remarkable text, first properly reconstructed by scholars from multiple fragmentary tablets in the early 20th century, purports to record every king who ever ruled in Mesopotamia going back to the very moment, in its own words, when kingship was lowered from heaven. And its opening section, describing the kings who supposedly ruled before the Great Flood, contains a detail so strange that it still generates genuine academic debate today. According to the list, the first antediluvian king, a ruler named Alalim of the city of Eridu, reigned for 28,800 years. The kings that followed him have similarly, almost incomprehensibly long reigns, with the combined total of all 8 or 10 kings who ruled before the flood adding up to well over 200,000 years of recorded kingship. An obvious impossibility by any ordinary measure of human lifespan, yet recorded with the same flat, matter-of-fact tone scribes used to record ordinary tax receipts and grain shipments. Historians have proposed several competing explanations for these enormous numbers, ranging from ancient numeral systems being misread or later miscopied by confused scribes to symbolic or ceremonial uses of specific numbers tied to the Sumerian base 60 counting system. The same system that gives us 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle today. What almost nobody in mainstream Assyriology or Near Eastern archaeology accepts, however, is the fringe theory made famous by later pseudo-historical writers claiming these vast numbers prove ancient astronauts, extraterrestrial gods called the Anunnaki, actually lived among early humans and ruled for genuine tens of thousands of years using alien longevity technology. That theory, most associated with the author Zecharia Sitchin starting in the 1970s, relies on translations and interpretations of Sumerian vocabulary that the overwhelming majority of professional cuneiform scholars, including Irving Finkel himself, have publicly and repeatedly rejected as inaccurate, unsupported by the actual grammar and vocabulary of the Sumerian language, and built on a fundamental misreading of words like Anunnaki, which in the authentic texts simply means the great gods or the princely offspring of the earth god An. A mythological term, not a literal description of visiting extraterrestrials. The genuinely interesting evidence-based story here isn't aliens. It's something arguably even more remarkable that 5,000 years ago, in the very first cities human beings ever built, scribes were already grappling with the same fundamental questions we still ask today. Where do we come from? Why do we suffer? Why do civilizations collapse? And they were doing it using systems of enormous symbolic numbers, oral memory stretched across countless generations, and genuine historical catastrophe reshaped into sacred narrative. Put all of these pieces together, the Eridu-Genesis, with its blunt admission that humans were built as a slave labor force from clay and the blood of a sacrificed god, the Atrahasis epic with its detailed account of divine irritation, plague, drought, and finally a world-ending flood, the Sumerian king list with its impossible antediluvian reign lengths, and now Irving Finkel's fully decoded Ark tablet with its startling revelation of a circular, coracle-shaped vessel built centuries or millennia before anyone wrote down the story of Noah, and you get a picture of human origins that is genuinely shocking, not because it proves ancient aliens or a literal historical Garden of Eden, but because it proves something arguably more profound. That the foundational origin story so many people today consider uniquely sacred and singular was, in fact, the latest retelling of a story that human beings had already been passing down, reshaping, and rewriting for at least 2,500 years before it ever reached the form we now call Genesis. The scribes of Nippur, Shuruppak, and Babylon were not writing fiction for entertainment. They were preserving what they believed to be genuine ancestral memory, technical knowledge, and divine instruction, pressed permanently into wet clay specifically so that fire, flood, and time itself could not erase it. It's worth slowing down on one more thread of this mythology, because it adds a layer of psychological complexity that most retellings of the Sumerian flood story leave out entirely, and it directly involves the same god who secretly saved humanity by whispering through a reed wall. Enki, also known by the later Babylonian name Ea, is consistently portrayed across Mesopotamian literature as humanity's protector, the clever, somewhat rebellious god of wisdom, magic, and fresh water, who repeatedly defies his older brother Enlil's harsher judgments in order to keep the human race alive. This divine rivalry is not a minor subplot. It is arguably the central tension running through the entire Mesopotamian understanding of why the world works the way it does, an ongoing negotiation between one god who wants order, silence, and control, and another who values ingenuity, survival, and, in a very real sense, the human capacity to outsmart even the gods themselves. A related and lesser-known text, the myth of Adapa, expands on this dynamic even further. In it, Enki grants a mortal named Adapa extraordinary wisdom, enough wisdom that when Adapa is summoned before Anu, the supreme sky god, to answer for accidentally breaking the wing of the south wind, Adapa is offered the bread and water of eternal life as a test. Enki, for reasons scholars still debate, warns Adapa in advance not to eat or drink anything offered to him in heaven, and Adapa obeys, unknowingly refusing the one gift that would have made humanity immortal. It is a haunting near-miss, a story about how close humanity supposedly came to permanent immortality and lost it, not through sin or disobedience, as in the Genesis account of Eden, but through obedience to a warning that turned out to be tragically, perhaps deliberately mistaken. Scholars have long noted the eerie structural echo between Adapa's forfeited immortality and Adam's forfeited immortality in Genesis, two origin stories separated by well over 1,000 years, in an entirely different language, both hinging on a piece of food that determines whether humanity lives forever or not. The technical side of the Ark tablet deserves one more close look too, because the sheer specificity of its instructions is part of what convinced scholars this was never meant as vague poetic imagery, but as something the original audience understood as genuinely practical shipbuilding advice. Finkel's translation includes a term, parsiktu, referring to a specific unit of capacity used elsewhere. In Mesopotamian administrative and trade documents, the exact kind of vocabulary you would expect in a shipping manifest or construction contract, not a religious hymn. The tablet even describes the rope work in a way that mirrors real Marsh-era boat-building techniques still documented by anthropologists working in southern Iraq in the 20th century, where enormous coiled, Ropes made from bundled reeds were used to build the rigid structural ribs of large, round guffa boats, exactly the kind of vessel the tablet seems to be describing at a wildly exaggerated mythologized scale. This is precisely why Finkel has argued that the story likely originated among people who had genuine, hands-on experience with riverboat building, embedding real nautical engineering knowledge into a sacred narrative about surviving the end of the world, a detail that would have made perfect, vivid, practical sense to a Sumerian farmer living beside the Euphrates, even if it reads as strange and unfamiliar to modern audiences raised on illustrations of a wooden ark that looks more like a Renaissance galleon than anything an actual Bronze Age Mesopotamian would have recognized. All of this evidence converges on a single, genuinely humbling realization that deserves to sit with you long after this video ends. The oldest known writing system on the planet was not invented to record poetry or philosophy first. It was invented in Sumer, roughly 5,200 years ago, primarily for economic bookkeeping, tracking grain shipments, beer rations, and temple inventories. And yet, within just a few centuries of inventing writing at all, the very same civilization was already using that technology to wrestle with the biggest questions imaginable. Why humanity exists, why we suffer in labor, why civilizations get wiped out by catastrophe, and whether there was ever a path to escaping death altogether. Every later tradition that grapples with those same questions, including the one many people alive today still consider the original and final word on the subject, was arriving late to a conversation that had already been going on, carved into clay, for 2,500 years. And in a strange, almost poetic twist of history, that is exactly what worked. Ironically, it was fire that helped preserve these tablets rather than destroy them, because when ancient libraries like Ashurbanipal's Great Library at Nineveh were burned during war and conquest, the intense heat baked the raw clay tablets rock hard, accidentally fireproofing them for thousands of years underground, until archaeologists began unearthing them by the tens of thousands starting in the 19th century. There are still an estimated 500,000 cuneiform tablets sitting in museum storage rooms around the world today, in London, Berlin, Philadelphia, Istanbul, and Baghdad. The overwhelming majority of them never translated, never even fully cataloged, because there are simply not enough trained cuneiform specialists left in the world to read them all. Irving Finkel himself has said publicly that new discoveries, new pieces of humanity's earliest recorded thoughts about where we came from, are likely sitting in drawers and storage boxes right now, waiting for someone with the patience to sit down, the way he did with a water-damaged tablet from a private collection, and spend years slowly coaxing 5,000 years of buried memory back into the light, which raises the question that should genuinely keep you up at night. If a tablet capable of quietly rewriting the world's oldest story about the flood and the origins of humanity itself was sitting misidentified in a drawer for decades before anyone realized what it said, what else is still down there, waiting to be found, and waiting to change everything we think we already know?